Okay. Now do some attendance. Bryant is not here yet. Curry is online. Darby is here. Fisher is online. Hamilton. Come in. Ashley's online. Crystal's online. Taylor's online. Norris, not here yet. Rollins, not here yet. Saunders is online. Chamberlain is here. Vargas is online. Did I miss anybody? I think that's it. I know it's early, but I'll go ahead and do announcements so we can get hit the ground running once it's 8 o'clock. So I remind you, this week's lab is online, but it's not like the last one where you had to watch a video. So we will meet in person. But as usual, if you get it done and I get it graded before Wednesday, then you don't need to come in. It's a pretty easy lab, I think. But anyway, take a look. It does have a pre-lab, a short video you need to watch. Of course, technically the pre-lab's past due, but I'd go ahead and work on it if you haven't yet. And Brian is here. Yeah, what else? Lab. Again, I'll remind you, exam 3 is open for you to retake again. You can take it as many times as you want. It's open book. There's no time limit. You just have to let me know once you're done, once you've taken it the last time. Because again, you can take it as many times as you want. Tell me, so I can go in and adjust your grade. If you get a lower grade somehow, then we'll just keep your higher grade. So it's usual stuff. Norris is here. And if you need help finding exam 3, I mean, it should be in your old emails, but I understand you don't save all your old emails. So let me know if you need me to resend exam 3 for you, and I'll be glad to do that. And again, this has to be done by the end of this week. So for Thanksgiving break, you need to have it done before Thanksgiving break. Because after that, I will talk to you if anybody wants to meet me and get feedback on exam 3 and understand which questions you missed and why you missed them. You get the 5% boost to your grade, you get all the correct answers, and you're going to need that for the final. Because remember, the final, about half of that is made up of the first 3 exams. That's it for announcements. Any questions? All right, let's jump into it. I don't say we're behind, but we're close to being behind. So anyway, we've ended off talking about invasive species. I gave you some examples. Here's the last example that we did talk about, which is the Burmese python. People have them as pets, and then they think the nice thing to do when they don't want them anymore is to set them loose. And yes, that is nice for the individual animal, for that snake, but then it's an invasive species down there because none of the wildlife has evolved to evade those things. Actually, in the news, someone just caught a record large, I think it was the second largest ever caught in Florida, last week. So interesting timing. Anyway, those are just some examples. Long story short, invasive species are bad. And again, for independent work, if you want, you can write some papers on that. Some of them are pretty interesting. And again, some of them might be surprising. Like there's a lot of birds that people think, oh, these are pretty birds, but they're actually invasive. A lot of plants that are invasive. A lot of cats are invasive, things like that. So anyway, well, let's do attendance words. The first word for attendance would be daughter. Today is my daughter's 22nd birthday, so today is for her. Anyway, let's talk about biological control of pests. Here we go. Invasive species benefit from the absence of pathogens, predators, and herbivores, right? So this is one of the reasons why invasive species, when they become invasive, that's one of the reasons why. There's just not things that are there to kill them, right? There's no pathogens, like there's no diseases in this new area that will kill them. And obviously, again, there aren't things that have evolved to eat them, right? Like stink bugs, right? Stink bugs don't have predators right here, or herbivores if it's a particular plant. And that's where we get biological control. You should know what biological control is for the exam. I might give you an example of something, and then you should recognize it as biological control. And biological control is the release of a natural enemy to attack a pest population. In the context of this conversation, it's to attack a invasive species conversation, but that's just this particular conversation. That was more like a segue to the last conversation we were having to this conversation. So I should point out that it's not always just to use to combat invasive species. Again, it is sometimes used as just a regular pest population. So, and I'm going to give some examples in the next slides. But for example, that I don't think we have one is, no, right there, second bullet point, sorry. Right, so a lot of agriculture uses biological control because it controls insects, weeds, other organisms that reduce crop yield. So before I give you some examples of some biological control, does anybody have any questions about biological control so far? All right. So this is an example not from your textbook, and just like any example, not just because it's not from your textbook, but I'm not going to ask you any questions about this example. Again, it's just an example. For the exam, I'll give you some other hypothetical example or some example I've never given you before, and you need to recognize this as biological control. But anyway, here's an example of an effective type of biological control. There's a stuff called St. John's wort. It's an invasive species from Europe. It's long-lived. It's overgrown millions of acres of rangeland and pasture. And again, I like to go back to what I was talking about last week, where some of this stuff isn't necessarily common sense, right? If you just look out into a field, see a bunch of green stuff, I would even think, well, that looks good. Plants are good. We need plants. But that's not always the case. And in this case, and again, going back to the stuff I was saying last week, it's not all about being a tree hugger or, oh, I love nature and let's not disturb the balance, which is how I feel. But it's not all about that. In this case, it's killing off the plants that the livestock need to eat, right? So if you like eating meat, or if you're into making money and you know that there's businesses that sell raise cattle for that, then it's affecting that, right? So this isn't just let's take care of nature. This is also an economic thing. But anyway, what they did was they looked at where the St. John's wort was from. They found out it's natural herbivores, right? It's natural predator, if you will. They brought them in. In this case, it was these imported leaf beetles, and it worked. And they reduced the weed down to less than 5% of the original or the previous population size. So again, that's an example of when it worked, and I really like that example because again, it's not just about protecting the ecosystem for the sake of protecting the ecosystem. There's money involved, right? And a lot of times that's all people care about. Anyway, any questions about that example that I'm not going to give you questions on? Okay, well, it doesn't always work. Here's an example of when it failed. Mongooses, right? I don't know if you know what mongooses are, but they're fierce carnivores. They eat rats. They eat a lot of other things. But the purpose of this conversation, that was the main focus, right? Like they eat rats. So we had rats, not we, but here in the Caribbean and other places, these rats were invasive. So they thought, well, let's get these mongooses because mongooses eat rats. That'll take care of our rat problem. And it did. It did take care of the rat problem. They introduced them to the cane fields where they were growing sugar canes. They killed all the rats, but then they had other issues. They escaped the cane fields and went to other natural habitats, and then they became invasive themselves, right? So then they started killing natural populations of reptiles, amphibians, birds, all this kind of stuff. So again, it doesn't always work. It's not always a good thing. This is why humans sometimes really screw things up. But once again, I'm going to put a big X to this, indicating that you do not have to know anything about that. That's just an example. And I'm not going to ask you specific questions about that. So again, for the exam, I'll just give you some hypothetical example, real or not, I don't know. And you need to recognize it as biological control. Any questions? All right, here's a picture of a mongoose. It's about to eat some sort of egg. I'm sure that's an egg of some sort of native bird, probably endangered. So again, these PowerPoints are from your last textbook. Your last textbook had this in every chapter, and as always, I'm going to skip it. It's called The Process of Science. Again, I'm not going to ask you any questions about it, but I would read it every time, every chapter. If I were you, I'd read it. If you have the PowerPoints, it's a good thought exercise. It really helps you understand the process of science. Scientific method. All right, so now let's talk about integrated pest management. So the last thing I taught you about, I think it was pretty easy, right? Biological control of pests. Like I keep saying, for the exam, I'm going to give you some example. You need to recognize it as biological control of pests. That in itself seems pretty easy. But now it gets a little bit more complicated because I'm going to introduce you to something called integrated pest management. And it's not completely different than biological control of pests. So that's why it's going to get a little bit more difficult for the exam. Because again, just like in the biological control of pests, I will probably give you some hypothetical example of someone using integrated pest management, and you need to recognize it as integrated pest management, as opposed to biological control of pests. Anyway, As I mentioned really a long time ago when I first started this chapter, agricultural operations create their own highly managed ecosystems, right? So this is not willy-nilly. It's not like just things growing any way they want, right? We manage it. We choose what grows there, what doesn't grow there. Another thing, they have usually a genetically similar individuals or a monoculture, right? So if you look at a field, it's probably going to be a field of corn or a field of soy, right? It's not like when you look out in the woods and see all these different species of trees growing. When you look at a field like a farm, they're growing usually the same crop. Another bad thing is they're planted close to each other. So basically, all these things lead up to one thing, right? All these things, like when you look at agriculture operations, they function as a banquet for plant-eating animals, like insects, pathogenic bacteria, viruses, and fungi, right? So if you, again, just using corn as an example, if you are an animal that eats corn, right, then the corn farm is going to be perfect for you. It's all right there. That's all there is corn. They're close, planted close next to each other. Anyway, this is still moving into what we're going to talk about for integrated pest management. But we're not there yet. Are there any questions so far? All right. Like most invasive species, most crop pests have opportunistic life history pattern that enables them to rapidly take advantage of a favorable habitat. So to remind you, because remember you do need to know this for the exam, an opportunistic life history basically is, as far as we're concerned, is the same as what a type 3 survivorship, right? So they don't live long, they live fast, so to speak, right? They show up, they take advantage of favorable situations. And the history of agriculture has a lot of examples of devastating pest outbreaks. So again, put it next to this. I'm not going to ask you any questions about these examples, but there's boll weevils that fed on cotton. That was big. I learned about that growing up because I grew up in the South. And that was a big thing back in the day. Anyway, yeah, that's just an example. And we're still getting there. We haven't quite gotten to talk about integrated pest management yet. We're just still kind of like leading into it. So are there any questions so far? All right, here's a picture of a boll weevil, in case you wanted to see what they look like. The next word for attendance, my daughter's name, Alexis. Even though I didn't say this previously for the first word, again, normal stuff. If you're here now or if you're live, send those words within 5 minutes of the class ending. And if you're watching the video, use the words in a sentence. Anyway, now we're finally getting into integrated pest management, right? Because usually when you think of agriculture and you think of growing crops, you think of pesticides. And pesticides are very often used. Even in organic farming, pesticides are used. A lot of people think that organic farming doesn't have pesticides, but organic farming is allowed to have pesticides. It just depends what kind of pesticides they use. But anyway, pesticides are not always good. Why? As we learned earlier when we talked about natural selection, they may result in populations that are not affected by the pesticide, right? So again, you spray the field, you kill all the weak ones. Some of them survive because for some reason genetically they were not susceptible, or at least completely susceptible to pesticide. So they survive, they reproduce, so now this new generation has those genes, those alleles. Another bad thing about pesticides, and this is really especially true when it comes to organic, they kill the pest, but they also kill the natural predators of the pest. Right? So yes, you're killing what you're trying to kill, but you're also killing the things that kill what you're trying to kill. And again, this is really big with organic pesticides, because the thing about organic pesticides is they have to be natural. Unlike synthetic pesticides, and synthetic pesticides can be very specific to the insect they're killing. Organic ones are just like kill every kind of insect. So this is, again, this bullet point is a lot more common with organic stuff. Same with this next bullet point, right? So pesticides may also kill the pollinators, right? So yes, you're killing your pests, but you're also killing the things that are pollinating your crops, and that's not good either, right? And again, more common with natural pesticides used in organic. So anyway, point being here, and I don't know if I'm going to ask you these questions, but the point being is, even though we do use pesticides, the point is they're not perfect, right? So we also want to limit how much pesticides we use for these reasons. And that finally brings us to what we need to know. Integrated pest management, abbreviated IPM. This uses a combination of biological, chemical, and cultural methods. Right? So it's not just pesticides. It's not just what we talked about previously, which was biological control of pests, right? It's bringing those together. In addition to cultural methods, which I'll talk about here in a second. But before I move on, just understand, as far as the exam is concerned, this is an important bullet point. Because in the exam, I'm probably going to give you an example. This, Farmer John did this, this, and this, and you should go, oh, Farmer John must be doing integrated pest management. So any questions about that so far? All right, well, let's talk about this thing. Like we already said, I already talked about biological control of pests, right? So I don't know if you were to bring in ladybugs eat aphids, right? So that would be a biological control of pests. Chemical, right? That is pesticides. Pesticides are chemical control of pests. So then what does it mean by cultural methods? And that's on this next slide. So integrated pest management advocates for tolerating low level of pests. So yeah, we're trying to get rid of these crop pests, but the goal isn't total eradication, right? So that's a cultural thing, right? That's more like the decisions you're making. It also advocates for lowering the carrying capacity, right? We learned about that, lowering the carrying capacity for these pests. The way they can do that is use pest-resistant varieties of crops. They can use mixed species plantings, meaning like, all right, instead of just having a cornfield, you have corn in this part of the field, you got a little soy in there, maybe you've got peanuts growing in the same field, right? That way it's not just one big smorgasbord for whatever pests, because sometimes these pests are very specific. There might be an animal that eats corn that won't eat soy, right? So it's a good thing to use mixed species planting. Likewise, there's crop rotation. So crop rotation is sort of like mixed species planting, except instead of having different crops in the same field, you have different crops in different years, right? So this year I'm growing corn. Next year I'm going to grow soy. The year after that I'm going to grow squash, whatever it may be, right? You mix it. That way, year one you got a bunch of pests that want to eat corn, and then they come back around for year two to eat some corn, but instead you've grown soy, so they have nothing to eat, right? So again, you don't need to memorize this necessarily, but in the hypothetical example, this is some of the stuff I might mention. Like Farmer John was growing corn and soy in the field, right? You should think, oh yeah, that's mixed species planting. That is a cultural thing. That might be IPM, integrated pest management. And again, like I said earlier in the last slide, we also IPM still does use biological control when possible. And that's what this picture is, like I mentioned earlier. Aphids, you can see them all over the place, right? Those are bad for most crop plants, but ladybugs eat them. Any questions about that? Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about, and I think we might be able to finish this chapter today, I hope. The last main bullet point is human population growth. And if you've had my Bio 108 class, a lot of this is going to be a review for you, but this is important. Before I even get into it, I'll just say this. Again, if you've had Bio 108, you know this, but human population growth is an issue. Biologically, as far as the environment is concerned, obviously we're going to run out of resources and space eventually. Now, some people say, oh, it's going to happen in the next 10 years. And some people say, we don't know when it's going to happen. So I'm not even going to tell you when it's going to happen. Just common sense will tell you, as the population grows and grows and grows, eventually we're going to run out of space, right? Run out of space to grow food, run out of space to live, run out of space to put our garbage. So just keep that in the back of your mind. I'm saying it is an issue environmentally, but I'm not saying it's going to be within our lifetime. So yeah, keep that in mind. Another thing that I don't talk about in this course, because it's specifically about biology, but we do talk about it in the other course, is, long story short, we want to slow the population of the human growth. That would be good for the environment. But it is worth noting, and we don't talk about it in this, that there are negative aspects of slowing the human population growth economically, right? So it's good for the environment, but maybe for economics or, foreign policy. There's all kinds of other things you need to consider. But let's focus on the biology side of it. In the few seconds it takes you or me to read this sentence, approximately 21 people will be born somewhere in the world and 9 will die. So there we go. In that time, about 21 people just were born and 9 probably just died on average. Obviously, 21 is larger than 9, right? So we can see that our population is growing. And that's how, right? We have more people being born than dying. Obviously, that's what this next bullet point says. We've talked about it before. The cause of a population growth or decline is an imbalance between births and deaths. So again, what we're talking about human population growth for the entire world, right? So in this case, since we're talking about the entire world, we're not considering immigration, right? We're not considering, you know, West Virginia's population is decreasing because people are leaving West Virginia, right? But that doesn't matter in this conversation because we're talking about the entire world, right? Humans, unless we're talking about humans leaving the planet or humans coming in from another planet, which isn't happening, then that immigration discussion is not relevant. Anyway, the human population is expected to continue increasing for the next several decades. That might be a question for you. You need to know that. That's what we expect. We expect the human population to continue to increase. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky, and I might ask this too. The number of people added to the population each year has been declining since the 80s. Sounds weird, and if you think about it, that might be a little bit weird, but you have to really think about it, it might make sense. So we're still, even though since the 80s, the number of people we're adding every year has been decreasing, but we still expect the population to increase for a while. Hopefully this graph will help you understand why. But if you download the PowerPoint, you can click that link right there. There's an 11-minute video on human population growth. All right, now pay attention to this graph. It could be tricky. I'm going to try to explain this maybe in the terms of money. All right, this might make more sense if you think about this as money instead of humans. Before I get to that analogy, let's look at what it actually is. This is the total population, right? You can see for most of the human history, it's been very slowly growing, very slowly. Then all of a sudden it started skyrocketing, right? Skyrocketing in the 1900s, right after the Industrial Revolution. And then this line is where we are, or at least when the book was published, the old textbook, that's where the stopping point is, right? So all this data to the left is actual data that we have. Everything to the right is what's projected, like that little dotted line. Now, as you can see, like I said earlier in that previous slide, we expect the human population to continue to increase. So let's talk about the difference between the bars and the line, right? So the bars is the total population. The line is the total population. The bars, that's the average annual increase. So again, what we're expecting here and what has happened since the 80s, the amount of humans added every year has been decreasing. You guys see that, right? See how those bars are going down? Yet the population is still increasing. And the way I think this makes sense is if you think about it in terms of money. So let's say you have a bank account and you're not spending any money. But let's say 5 years ago you put $10,000 in your bank account. And again, you're not spending any money. And then after that year, you put $9,000 in your bank account. And then the year after that, you put $8,000 in your bank account. You see where I'm going? You're still adding money to your bank account. Even though you're adding less and less every year, you're still adding money to your bank account. So your bank account's still going to grow. Does that make sense? I hope so. Anyway, that's what's happening in the human population. So even though we're adding fewer humans than we used to, we're still adding a lot. And we're still adding them, and therefore the human population is still increasing. And keep in mind, too, eventually we will hit carrying capacity, and that's a concept we learned about last week. Anyway, any questions about this graph? You probably won't see it on the exam. There's nothing to study, nothing to memorize when you're studying. If anything, I might give you this graph and ask you to decipher it and say something like, what year did the average annual increase peak? And you can just look at this bar and figure it out, right? It's questions like that. There's questions where you might have to decipher a graph. All right, there's no questions. We'll move forward to the history of human population growth, even though I just mentioned it when I showed you that graph. This will probably be a question. This right here will probably be a question. Through most of the human history, well, not that part, sorry, we'll get there. But this is true too. Through most of human history, parents have had a lot of children, right? So these days, how many of you have more than 3 siblings? Actually, you do? How many do you have? 4. Okay, so even then, that's not much. And you guys have siblings? You do? But less than 1? Okay. I have what? I don't know. I think I've got 5. I don't know. My dad, he had fun. Anyway, I don't have that many siblings either. But back in the day, people had a lot of kids. And the reason was, I hate to say it, but it's kind of true. Well, one of the reasons is you kind of had to hedge your bets because the death rate was a little bit higher, right? So most of your kids I shouldn't say most, not all of your kids made it. So they thought, well, need to have a bunch of them. So even though people were having a lot of children, what had happened was, because there were so many deaths, like I showed you in this graph, let me go back to it, graph, right? It's still barely moving up, right? It's increasing, but not much, because even though there's a high birth rate, there's also a really high death rate. So those things equaled out. So then what happened? Well, then things started getting better, right? Your book goes into exactly why. The long story short, because of a bunch of stuff, nutrition, sanitation, a relative peaceful, or relatively lack of war, other than a couple of exceptions, right? Because of all these reasons, the death rate started to decrease, right? So culturally, humans were still having a lot of kids, but the death rate was decreasing. So that's what happened, right? That's why this is what has caused our population to start skyrocketing. So again, for most of human history, it was going really slow, then all of a sudden it started skyrocketing. And this is why. Because again, the death rate started going down, but the birth rates didn't. And we kept the birth rates up, and therefore it started to skyrocket. And here's the slide that says that, right? The world population skyrocketed from 2 billion in 1927 to 3 billion 33 years later. I can ask you those specifics. So when you are studying this portion, you don't need to memorize any of these numbers. I'm giving you these numbers, but you don't need to memorize them. So anyway, at this point, scientists became alarmed, obviously, because that's a big jump. So they started doing things. Most of the stuff they did, well, some places like China actually made some laws, but other places it was all about education. Like, hey, did you know you shouldn't have this many kids for this reason? That's a really big simplification, but that did happen. Anyway, for a bunch of reasons, the overall growth rate did peak in 1962, at which point developed nations, like the United States, for example, is a developed nation, because in our countries there was advanced medical care that continued to improve survivorship, effective contraceptives held down birth rates. So yes, we were still having a low death rate, but now, because of contraceptives and other reasons too that we don't need to get into in this course, the birth rate started to go down, right? So it started kind of evening out. Yeah, that's what that little point is right there, right? The overall growth rate of the world's population began a downward trend as the difference between birth rates and death rates decreased. So yeah, long story short, again, like I said, for most of the human population, most of history, the human population was growing slowly because there was, the death rate was so high, even though there was a high birth rate. And then what happened is, again, we started lowering the death rate, but still had a high birth rate, so things started skyrocketing. And then we got a hold of that, and things changed, like, contraceptives and other stuff. And the birth rate started to decrease, and now things are a little bit more equal, at least a lot more equal than they were a while ago. Any questions about this slide? All right, once again, when you're studying, you do not need to know these numbers, but there they are for you. Some comparisons. You can see the world population versus more developed country versus less developed countries. Actually, yeah, let me point that out before we move forward, because there was no bullet points on this. So it is worth noting, and it's still the case, not specifically these numbers, but the gap is still there. For more developed countries, the growth rate is usually lower than less developed countries, right? So poorer countries still have a higher birth rate, generally speaking. And more developed countries generally have a lower growth rate. So that is something you need to know, not specifically that number, like 0.3 versus 1.3. But you do need to know the richer countries do have a lower a lower growth rate. And the bigger countries still have a larger growth rate. That will be important, because there's going to be some other dichotomies between richer countries and poorer countries that we'll talk about later. Like in the lab that you're going to do this week, your ecological footprint is generally going to be larger in America than if you were from Zimbabwe or someplace like that. Anyway, any questions about this table? All right, let's talk about age structures. Now, we talked about age structures before. I gave you the example of that bird, and I was saying, if you're studying this bird and you just got to this island where this bird lives, you can look at the age structure and then figure out, some history about that bird. Even though you just got there, you could see, what may have happened 10 years ago based on the age structure of the population. Now we're going to talk about age structure in the context of humans. So it's the same thing, but the context is different. In this case, we're more concerned about the population's future growth, right? So age structure helps predict the population's future growth. And I'll just show you what I mean with this next slide. So we're looking at age structure in Mexico for 2 different years. Like that's actual data from 1989, actual data from 2012. And then based on that, they can predict what it's going to be like in 2035. And the only reason this is happening, the way we can figure this out, well, first let me say this, because this might be a test question. When you have an age structure that has like a very big pyramid, like a very big base, very small top, what's that mean? That means you have a lot of young people, right? A lot of young people, fewer old people. And what happens is those young people, they grow up eventually to childbearing age. So these young people grew up to the childbearing age, and then they had children, right? And you can see here that the pyramid still has a big base, but it stopped getting bigger. Does that make sense? Like this looks about the same height. This looks more like a pyramid. This kind of looks like we're working on a bottle. Same here. And then we look here, and it looks more like a bottom, right? We stopped with the outward growth, meaning that we're having fewer children, right? So we still have a huge population, and it's still maintaining itself, but it's not growing as much, right? Anyway, that's the age structure. That's not too important for you as biology or non-biology majors when we're talking strictly about the environment and things like that. But this could be useful for you. Again, I mentioned this last week. If you're a criminal justice major, or if you're an education major, or if you're a business major, because all this stuff, this stuff matters. Because when you're looking at the age structure, you can predict, we're going to have a lot more older people in 2035. So we're going to need more nursing homes. And it looks like about the same size for the children. So maybe we don't need necessarily more schools, right? It's things you can plan. Anyway, you can go on and on about that. Marketing, right? You're showing different things to old people generally than you are to teenagers, for example. So all the different majors could be accounted for in that discussion. Anyway, any pictures about this? The big old X through here, once again, to remind you, this is just an example. You don't need to memorize those numbers. If anything, and this probably won't happen either, I will give you this and ask you a question so you will need to decipher it and be able to read a graph, but that probably won't happen. Anyway, one of the things I mentioned, I just didn't give it this word, is population momentum. That is the continued growth in a population after the high fertility rate was reduced to replacement rate. So let me back up again. That's what we're looking at here. You can see that generally speaking, that's not getting any bigger, right? That means this generation has had enough kids to replace themselves, but not have more, right? Unlike this generation, right? Those generations had a bunch of kids, there's more humans at this age than there are this age, because they're having more kids. So they weren't just replacing their numbers, they were growing it, right? But here, that shape indicates they're just kind of replacing themselves. But because there's so many of them, that even though we are not reducing, adding more people, the population growth isn't getting bigger, there's still a lot of population growth in general. And your book got pretty specific. It says this results from girls at the age of 0 to 14 getting past those years and hitting childbearing years. Anyway, I'd say the important thing for the exam is to know there's 2 parts. Know what population momentum is. If you download the PowerPoint, you can click that link and watch a 2-minute video on population momentum. Are there any questions about population momentum? All right, the next word for attendance will be girls. So again, just send the word in if you're here or if you're online. But if you're watching the video later, send that word in a sentence. All right, so I was hinting at this earlier, but here it is in writing. Age structure diagrams indicate social conditions, right? So again, this is beyond biology if you think about it this way. An expanding population has an increasing need for schools, employment, infrastructure. Again, all these things you can look at when you look at the age structure. Because older people need things different than younger people. Growing populations need something different than shrinking populations. Here's this kind of the same graph, same years, 1989 versus 2012 versus the projected 2035. But I think this is from the US. Yeah, this US population. And again, I'm not gonna ask you any questions about it, but you can see here the baby boom, right? I don't know if you guys know anything about the baby boomers, but after World War II, there was a baby boom because the people who survived had a lot of kids, generally speaking. But then things started evening out. Anyway, no questions about that on the exam. But do you have any questions about that graph? All right, let's talk about the last bullet point of this chapter. And it is our ecological footprint. That's what your lab is about, so this is perfect timing. The U.S. Census Bureau projects that the global population, oh yeah, this is so outdated. I need to fix this. This is back when the old textbook was first published. So back then, this was a correct bullet point. Now, what it should say is the global population is now past 8 billion. That's what it should say. But of course, this part still has yet to come, but yes, we do predict 9.6 by 2050. And it's funny, they were pretty spot on with the whole when it was going to happen for 8 billion. So yeah, we just recently passed 8 billion. That's a lot of people, right? So then the question is, and there's a whole chapters devoted to this, actually almost the entire course when you think about it for Bio 108. Do we have sufficient resources to sustain 9 billion people, right? So the most obvious thing is world food production. Obviously, we need to feed people, right? We need to accommodate people that are expected to live in the coming decades. But not only that, but think about it. There's people currently starving to death. So we're looking at two different challenges here. First of all, there's people literally dying right now because they don't have enough food on this earth. And then we have taken the fact that there's going to be more people. And also I want to point out, because your book only kind of briefly discusses it, it's not just about food, right? This is also about where to live, where we're putting our waste, where are we getting the coal for our electricity and the cobalt for our electric vehicles, all this stuff, right? All the things we need to live, the wood to build our houses. Anyway, back to what the old textbook is saying. This is just an example. Once again, a bunch of numbers. I'm not going to ask you about, so I'll put it next to it, but let's talk about it. Agricultural lands are already under pressure, right? Because again, the human population is growing, therefore we need more food. Not only that, but there's a lot of waste of food too, and we don't have time to get into that. But what's happened is a lot of overgrazing, like when we talk about cattle and things like that, has turned grassland into desert. Water usage has gone up 6 times in the past 70 years, right? So for 70 years ago, it was 6 times less than it is now. And there's also been changes in precipitation that have caused food shortages in some regions. So like I said, some people are starving to death on Earth. And it's not because we don't have enough food, because we do, we waste a lot of food. It's about getting the food to the places where it's needed. But anyway, because so much open space is needed to support an expanding population, another consequence of this, and again, your book is just focusing on food here, but there's a bunch of other stuff. Other species are expected to become extinct, right? So the bigger our population gets, our species gets, then the fewer other species there are. And again, that's what I don't have time to talk about too much, but you would know if you had Bio 108, is this is big. This isn't, and I hate to keep using this term, but this isn't just a bunch of tree hugging stuff. So sure, if you're a tree hugger, you might say, oh no, we don't want to lose the whales or whatever. So you might feel bad for losing a species. But what we haven't talked about yet is something called biodiversity, and we need these species just for Earth to operate properly, right? So this isn't just a matter of saving the trees because you love them, but we need them, right? So it is literally a matter of life and death. Anyway, this brings us to what you need to know for the exam and for the lab. What is your ecological footprint? It is the estimated area of land and water, and really air. It's about the estimated area of space required to provide the resources an individual or nation consumes. So in this lab, you're going to look at your ecological footprint, right? You're going to take not a quiz necessarily, sort of a quiz. You're going to answer some questions from an online calculator, and it's going to tell you what your ecological footprint is. What is the estimated area of space required to provide resources for you? And of course, we already know what the ecological footprint is of the United States, and that'll be on there. We also know the ecological footprint of the whole world. That's on there. And of course, if you take the ecological footprint of the entire world and divide it by whatever the population is, like 8-something billion, then you'll have the average human population footprint. Same with the United States. We know the ecological footprint of the United States. So if you divide that by however many people are in America, then we know the average ecological footprint of the United States. And that's one of the things you're going to do. Not only are you going to calculate your ecological footprint, but then you need to be able to compare it. Like, how does your ecological footprint compare to the average world citizen or the average citizen of the United States? But anyway, yes, like I said, it's not just about agriculture. It's all the stuff we need, right? It is food, but it's also fuel, right? So it takes space for you, to mine coal for our electricity or to drill oil for the gasoline that runs your vehicle. Housing, right? So not just the space of land that your house sits on, but all the land that had the trees that were cut down to build your house, right? All that stuff. And of course, again, like I was saying earlier, the ability to absorb waste, right? So where are we putting all your trash? What about all the carbon emissions that you're responsible for? All that stuff. So is there any question about what an ecological footprint is? All right, keep in mind, this is one of the most missed questions on the lab. The US footprint is generally larger, or is, the average US footprint is larger than the average worldwide footprint. So keep that in mind when you ask your hypothesis or answer your hypothesis questions. So one of the questions is going to ask you before you do the calculator, do you think your footprint is larger or smaller than the world population? So I'll go ahead and tell you now, if you think your footprint is smaller than the world footprint, then obviously it's going to be much smaller than the US footprint. Does that make sense? Because the US has a larger footprint. People mess this up all the time. They'll say, I think my footprint's going to be smaller than the world footprint, but about the same as the US footprint, which doesn't make sense. The US footprint is larger than the world footprint. So keep that in mind when you're answering that question. Also, with the questions after that too, they're going to be pretty specific. They're going to say, the average ecological footprint for the world was, and it'll give you a number, and then it'll say, what do you think your number is? So again, if you think your ecological footprint is, larger than the world footprint, then choose a number that is larger than the world footprint. So those first two questions that you answer are going to dictate whether the rest of your answers are correct. I hope that makes sense. It'll make sense once you look at the lab. Anyway, so you need to know what an ecological footprint is. Let's talk about the next concept, which is biocapacity. You need to know this too. When we compare our demand for resources, i.e. our ecological footprint, to Earth's capacity to renew those resources, i.e. biocapacity, that gives us a better view of the sustainability of human activities. Long story short, the biocapacity is like, all right, this is how much the Earth can put out, and your ecological footprint is how much you're using. So obviously, if you're using more than the biocapacity, that's not sustainable because eventually you're going to run out of resources. That's all that means. So, are there any questions about this slide? This is an important slide for the exam. Before I go on and give you some other examples that you don't necessarily need to memorize. All right, way back when your old textbook was published, according to the World Wildlife Fund, the average ecological footprint for the world population was about 1.5. I think it still is. 1.5 times the planet's biocapacity per person. Meaning, if whatever the Earth is putting out, we are using 1.5 times that, right? So we're using more than is being produced by the Earth. We are overshooting our biocapacity, right? We're depleting our resources. This next slide kind of shows this stuff that I'm talking about, right? Here's the world average for what? Sorry. That's the Earth's biocapacity. World average footprint. And you can see overall, we are using more than what's being produced. And that's not sustainable. Eventually, we're going to run out of space. We're going to run out of resources. So it is literally, again, like I said earlier, it is a matter of life and death. It isn't just tree hugging hippie stuff. It's a matter of life and death. Even if it's not imminent, right? Even if it's not for another 50 years or 500 years, I don't know that answer, but it is eventually, this is going to catch up to us. But again, another thing you need to notice is here's the world average, right? And like I said earlier, the United States average is a lot larger than the world average. So keep that in mind when you're answering your hypotheses questions. right? If you think your footprint is larger than the US average, which it very well could be, then obviously it's gonna be much larger than the world average. Or again, if you think your footprint is smaller than the world average, obviously it's gonna be much smaller than the US average. Anyway, any questions about this? All right, another thing I mentioned earlier in the context of population growth is this, but now we're gonna talk about it in the context of ecological footprint. And I've been hinting at it, except I've been specifically talking about the United States. Affluent nations consume a disproportionate amount of resources. Meaning richer countries use more stuff, right? We use more stuff. So again, like I said earlier, like I showed you that chart, right? For the more developed countries, the richer countries, our growth rate is less than poorer countries. So yes, their population is growing quicker than ours, but generally speaking, richer countries were like using almost all the resources. Specifically, the richest countries, which account for 15% of the global population, right? A very small portion of the global population, account for 36% of the total footprint. I'm only putting it next to this just to indicate I don't need you to memorize those numbers. But that is a big deal, right? We're using, that's a very small portion of our, of the global population that's accounting for a large portion of the footprint. And then think about, and I haven't looked into this, I'm curious. I'd love to know the ecological footprint of the ultra wealthy, right? The few billionaires that are on Earth. I bet they're using even more of the total footprint. Anyway, this is another question that you'll kind of you'll deal with in the lab. But providing everyone with the same standard of living as the United States would require us to have 4 Earths, right? Because we in the United States use so many resources. If everyone lived like us, we would need more Earths to be able to sustain it, specifically 4 of them. That will be another test question or another question on the lab for you. One of them is going to be a hypothesis question, right? So given this, if everyone lived like you, then how many Earths would we need, right? So again, this is just a hint for your lab. If you think that you are about average to the United States citizens, then your answer here would be, oh, about 4 Earths, right? It would make sense because that's talking about the average US citizen. Anyway, any questions about that slide? All right, here's a picture, 2 different pictures. It's a kitchen in Afghanistan up top and a kitchen in the United States in the bottom. You see there's just a lot of differences, right? We're using a lot more resources in the richer countries than we are in the poorer countries. Let's see, and the last word for attendance will be cheese grater. So again, if you guys send those words in within 5 minutes, you get your extra credit or credit if you're streaming live. And if you're watching the video, send cheese grater in a sentence. And that's it. We are done. 3 minutes to spare. I will see you on Wednesday or office hours if you need me.